On October 1, 1939, the ancient city of Warsaw ceased to exist as the world knew it. In the smoldering ruins of what had been Poland's greatest metropolis, not a single building remained untouched by the fury of modern warfare, and the screams of nearly 2 million people would echo through the rubble for generations to come. This is not a story of military triumph or strategic brilliance, but rather a tale of apocalyptic destruction so complete that it would forever change how humanity understood the nature of war itself. The fall of Warsaw was not merely the capture of a city. It was the systematic annihilation of an entire civilization. And to understand what happened in those 36 devastating days requires us to travel back to where it all began, to the moment when Adolf Hitler signed the order that would unleash hell upon one of Europe's most vibrant and culturally rich capitals. It was April 1939 when the Führer, having consolidated his power and absorbed Austria and Czechoslovakia without firing a shot, turned his gaze westward toward Poland. Hitler's ambitions were not merely territorial. They were ideological and utterly ruthless. He envisioned a new German order, a 1,000-year Reich, built upon the subjugation and annihilation of those he deemed racially inferior, and Poland, with its significant Jewish population and its historical position as a barrier between German and Soviet spheres of influence, represented an irresistible target for his expansionist dreams. The Polish government, led by Marshal Edward Rydz-Mgły, knew the storm was coming. Intelligence reports flooded into Warsaw with alarming frequency. German troops were massing along the border. Luftwaffe squadrons were being deployed to forward airfields, and Nazi propaganda was reaching a fever pitch, accusing Poland of persecuting ethnic Germans and threatening German security. Yet despite these warnings, Poland's leadership clung to hope, believing that the Western powers, particularly Britain and France, would honor their commitments to Polish independence and stand against Nazi aggression. That hope, as history would brutally demonstrate, was naive and tragically misplaced. On September 1, 1939, without warning or declaration of war, German forces crossed the Polish border in a coordinated assault that would introduce the world to a terrifying new concept in warfare: blitzkrieg, or lightning war. From the north came General George von Bock's Army Group North, striking toward Warsaw with devastating speed and mechanical precision. From the west came General Gerd von Rundstedt's Army Group South, driving through Polish defenses with overwhelming force. The Luftwaffe controlled the skies completely, and Polish air forces, equipped with obsolete aircraft, were swept aside in a matter of days. Warsaw's defense fell primarily to the Polish Modlin Army and the Warsaw Army under General Stefan Langner, composed of hastily mobilized reserves and whatever troops could be gathered from the collapse of the front lines. The city itself, with a population of over 1.3 million people, was woefully unprepared for what was to come. There were inadequate air raid shelters, insufficient anti-aircraft defenses, and virtually no chance of military victory against the German forces. Yet the people of Warsaw, knowing their city was the last bastion of Polish resistance, steeled themselves for the ordeal ahead. As German armies advanced with terrifying speed, Warsaw's civilian population began frantically digging trenches, constructing barricades, and preparing makeshift fortifications in the streets and squares where they had lived their entire lives. By mid-September, German forces had surrounded the city completely, trapping over 1 million civilians along with the defending Polish garrison. The noose was tightening, and Warsaw's leadership knew that surrender was not an option they would entertain. The bombardment began on September 7, 1939, and what followed was an intensity of destruction that had never been witnessed before in the history of urban warfare. The Luftwaffe, commanded by the ruthless General Wolfram von Richthofen, launched thousands of sorties against the defenseless city. German bombers appeared in waves, day after day, dropping incendiary bombs and high explosives that transformed Warsaw's wooden buildings into infernos and shattered its stone structures into powder. The Stukas, those terrifying dive bombers with their screaming sirens, added psychological terror to the physical devastation. Their piercing wails announcing death from above. Entire neighborhoods vanished in minutes. The old town, with its medieval architecture and centuries of history, was obliterated. The Praga district, on the eastern bank of the Vistula River, was almost completely flattened. Hospitals, schools, churches, and government buildings were targeted with apparent indiscriminate violence. The civilian death toll mounted with horrifying speed. Dozens killed here, hundreds there, and then thousands, as the bombardment continued relentlessly. The city's infrastructure collapsed under the onslaught. Water mains burst, leaving the population without clean drinking water. Sewage systems failed, creating sanitation nightmares that bred disease and pestilence. Power plants were destroyed, plunging entire sections of the city into darkness, even during daylight hours. Food supplies, which had never been abundant, began to run critically short as supply routes were cut off and the surrounding countryside fell under German control. The civilian population, which had initially believed the defense would last only days, watched in growing horror as the siege extended into its second, third, and fourth weeks. The psychological impact was devastating. People who had fled their homes in search of safety from the bombs discovered there was no safety anywhere in Warsaw. Families huddled in basement shelters, sometimes buried alive when buildings collapsed above them. Others wandered the streets, searching for food and water, stepping over corpses that lay where they had fallen, often for days before they could be buried. Typhus and dysentery began to spread through the crowded shelters and overcrowded hospitals. Madness was not uncommon. The constant noise of bombardment, the inescapable horror of mass death, the realization that escape was impossible, all combined to shatter the mental equilibrium of those who had the misfortune to be trapped in Warsaw. Yet amid this apocalypse, remarkable acts of courage and humanity emerged. Polish soldiers, knowing victory was impossible, fought with ferocious dedication to delay the German advance and protect the civilian population. Every street became a potential battle line, every building a fortress. Polish engineers and soldiers worked frantically to repair damaged fortifications, to construct new defensive positions, and to keep the Wehrmacht at bay for as long as possible, buying time for civilians to flee or to prepare themselves mentally for whatever fate awaited them. Civilians, too, displayed extraordinary bravery. Members of the Polish underground and ordinary citizens worked to establish underground networks to smuggle food, medicine, and weapons into the besieged city. Young Polish women served as nurses, tending to the wounded in hospitals under constant bombardment, working in conditions so horrific that many would be traumatized for the rest of their lives. Priests ministered to the dying in cellars and rubble-filled streets, offering what spiritual comfort they could in the face of such overwhelming suffering. Parents somehow maintained their dignity and composure, shielding their children from the worst of the horrors, singing to them in darkness to drown out the sound of explosions outside. The German strategy, it became clear, was not merely to capture Warsaw, but to destroy it completely, as a demonstration of Nazi power and as a warning to any nation that might consider resistance. This was warfare elevated to a form of psychological terror and collective punishment against an entire civilian population. The German commanders understood that Warsaw was not just a military objective, but a symbol of Polish independence and pride, and they were determined to annihilate it so thoroughly that the Polish nation would never rise again. General Johannes Blaskowitz, who commanded German forces in the siege, would later express misgivings about the tactics being employed. But such objections, even from senior commanders, carried little weight in Hitler's Reich. The bombardment intensified as September turned into October. Entire city blocks were reduced to rubble. The beautiful Warsaw that had been known as the Paris of Eastern Europe for its architecture, culture, and joie de vivre was being systematically erased from the map. The University of Warsaw, a center of intellectual life, was destroyed. The city's theaters and concert halls, which had hosted performances by the greatest artists of Europe, were reduced to smoldering shells. Libraries containing centuries of accumulated knowledge were consumed by fire. It was not merely a city being destroyed, it was an entire civilization being obliterated. By late September, as German forces pushed closer to the city center, and as the bombardment reached fever pitch, the Polish military command, under General Stefan Langner, realized that further resistance would only result in the complete annihilation of whatever remained of Warsaw's civilian population. On October 2nd, 1939, after 36 days of continuous fighting and bombardment, during which the Wehrmacht had been held at bay by desperate Polish defenders, supported by equally desperate civilian fighters, the decision was made to surrender. The terms offered by the Germans were harsh. The city would be occupied, the military would be disbanded, and the civilian population would be subject to Nazi rule. But at least the Polish command believed the bombardment would stop and some measure of civilian life could resume. On October 6, 1939, German troops marched into Warsaw in triumph. Columns of tanks and soldiers, their boots striking the pavement in synchronized rhythm, paraded through streets lined with weeping civilians. Swastika flags were raised over government buildings. The German military, which had conquered the city, but had been forced to fight for every block, every street, every building, felt a mixture of triumph and frustration. Their Führer had wanted a quick victory, and while Warsaw had eventually fallen, it had cost them dearly in time, effort, and resources. The cost in human terms was incalculable. During the 36-day siege, approximately 200,000 civilians and soldiers had been killed, making it one of the deadliest urban sieges in all of human history. Hundreds of thousands more had been wounded, diseased, or traumatized beyond measure. Entire families had been wiped out. Generations of cultural heritage had been destroyed. The Poles had delayed the German advance for more than a month, but the victory had come at an almost unbearable cost. As German soldiers occupied Warsaw, they were greeted not with roses and cheers as Hitler had promised his people, but with ash, rubble, and the stares of traumatized survivors, struggling to comprehend what had been done to them. The city they had conquered was barely habitable. Corpses still lay in the streets and beneath the rubble, where they would remain undiscovered for weeks or even months. The water supplies had been so severely damaged that disease was rampant. Food stocks had been completely exhausted. Disease, particularly typhus carried by lice that thrived in the filthy conditions, began to claim additional victims even as the gunfire fell silent. The German occupation authorities, rather than being moved to compassion by the suffering they saw, became even more ruthless. They imposed brutal martial law, executed civilian leaders, and began immediately implementing the most sinister aspects of Nazi ideology: the systematic persecution and eventual genocide of Polish Jews and Polish intelligentsia. The beautiful Jewish districts of Warsaw, which had contained the largest Jewish community in all of Europe, would soon be sealed off into a ghetto that would become one of the most horrific and lethal concentration camps of the Holocaust. But that is a story for another time, another chapter in the almost incomprehensible tragedy that would unfold across Europe over the next 6 years. The fall of Warsaw had immediate ramifications that reverberated across Europe and the world. The demonstration of German military prowess, combined with the complete absence of any effective French or British response, sent shock waves through European capitals. Nations that had believed themselves safe behind fortifications or treaties now understood the terrifying reality. The Wehrmacht was seemingly unstoppable. and Hitler's vision of a Nazi-dominated Europe was becoming a terrible reality. France and Britain had declared war on Germany in response to the invasion of Poland, but they had been powerless to prevent the catastrophe unfolding in Warsaw. The British and French had initially hoped to launch offensives that would force German troops to withdraw from Poland. But instead, within weeks, it became clear that the Polish campaign was essentially over. Poland, despite the bravery of its soldiers and citizens, had been completely conquered. The Western powers would eventually respond by going on the offensive in the West, but that too would end in disaster, with France falling within months. The fall of Warsaw signaled the beginning of the end of European civilization, as it had been known. What followed would be 6 years of total war, genocide, and destruction that would claim over 70 million lives and reshape the entire world. Warsaw's destruction was merely the opening movement in a symphony of horror that would consume the continent. The city itself would take decades to rebuild. Many of its most historic buildings would remain in ruins for years, monuments to the fury that had been unleashed upon them. The scars on the survivors would never fully heal. Entire families, entire communities, entire ways of life had been obliterated in those 36 days. The psychological impact on the Polish people was profound. A nation that had only recently regained its independence after more than a century of partition and foreign rule now found itself under the heel of perhaps the most totalitarian and murderous regime in human history. The hope and optimism that had characterized Poland in the interwar period would be replaced by decades of suffering, occupation, and terror. The fall of Warsaw must be understood not merely as a military event, but as a watershed moment in human history. It demonstrated that in the age of modern mechanized warfare, civilians were no longer safely removed from the battlefield. It showed that entire cities could be erased, that cultural heritage could be systematically destroyed, and that the traditional rules of war had been superseded by a new and terrifying logic in which the annihilation of civilian populations was not merely tolerated, but actively pursued as a strategic objective. It was a lesson that would be repeated across Europe and eventually across the world, as the Second World War spread like a plague across continents. The brave defenders of Warsaw, both soldiers and civilians, understood that they could not defeat the Wehrmacht through military force, but they could and did resist with a courage and determination that earned them a place of honor in the annals of human history. Their resistance, though ultimately futile in military terms, was a profound moral statement, a refusal to submit without a fight, a determination to preserve human dignity even in the face of overwhelming evil, a testament to the power of the human spirit to resist even when victory seems impossible. The fall of Warsaw did not end Polish resistance. In the years to come, Warsaw would become the center of one of the most significant underground movements in all of occupied Europe. Polish fighters would rise again during the Warsaw Uprising of 1944, and, although that too would end in tragedy and the near-complete destruction of what little remained of the city, it would demonstrate that the spirit of Polish resistance could not be broken by tanks and bombs. The fall of Warsaw in October 1939 was not merely the end of Polish independence in the short term, but rather the beginning of a struggle for survival and freedom that would last until the Soviet Red Army finally liberated the city in January 1945. By that time, Warsaw had been destroyed so completely that many believed it could never be rebuilt. Yet the Polish people, with the same courage and determination they had shown during the siege of 1939, would rebuild their shattered city from the rubble and ashes, creating a new Warsaw that would stand as a monument to human resilience and the indomitable will to survive. As we reflect on the fall of Warsaw from our vantage point in the 21st century, we must grapple with the profound questions it raises about the nature of warfare, the responsibilities of the international community, the fragility of civilization, and the capacity of human beings for both extraordinary cruelty and extraordinary courage. The defenders of Warsaw had no illusions about their chances of victory. Yet they fought anyway, and the civilians who endured the bombardment did so not because they believed they would prevail, but because they understood that to surrender without resistance would be a betrayal of everything they believed in and everything their ancestors had struggled to build. The fall of Warsaw stands as a sobering reminder of what can happen when totalitarian evil is not checked in its early stages. When the international community fails to uphold its principles, and when a people are left to face an overwhelmingly powerful enemy alone. It reminds us that history is not an abstract subject studied in textbooks, but rather a series of lived experiences filled with human drama, tragedy, and heroism. The people of Warsaw in September and October 1939 were not historical abstractions. They were real human beings, with hopes and dreams, families and loved ones, fears and aspirations, who found themselves caught up in one of the most terrible events of the 20th century. Their story deserves to be remembered not merely as a historical fact, but as a profound moral lesson about the dangers of unchecked aggression, the importance of international solidarity, and the extraordinary capacity of ordinary people to demonstrate courage and dignity, even when facing seemingly insurmountable odds. The fall of Warsaw was the day that the modern age of total war truly began, when the distinction between combatants and civilians was erased, when entire populations became targets, and when cities themselves became weapons of terror and instruments of genocide. It was a day that changed the world forever, and its lessons remain as vital and urgent today as they were in that tragic October of 1939.